Hi everybody, welcome to today's ISE webinar. We're going to be talking everything social mobility. I'll do introductions in a moment. My name's Steve Isherwood. I'm Chief Exec of the ISE, and I'll be acting as host today. The format for today is we're going to do roughly, I think, about half an hour, maybe a bit longer in terms of questions with the panel. We're going to have discursive format, and we've got some questions and topics we want to cover, but we really do want this to be as interactive as possible. So please use the Q&A. I'm not sure you can see the chat, unfortunately. I was trying to play around with Zoom because we got this on the webinar format rather than the meeting format because we can get more attendees basically. And we had well over 120 people sign up for this. So if you can't see the chat, do use the Q&A, pop comments and thoughts in there. We can see those. And I'll also use that Q&A to put questions to the panelists a bit later. We've left a good sort of 10 to 15 minutes for questions from yourself. So please do engage and please do ask questions. That will be great. Also, just so you're aware, we do record the webinar. If you're used to the way that ISE webinars works, you'll know you'll get a link pretty soon afterwards once it's downloaded into the cloud and done its magic. That will come a bit later, and we'll also be putting it on our website, so you'll be able to either go back and revisit stuff you were interested in, or please do share it amongst colleagues, friends, etc., because we're really keen to share as much of our learnings as possible. So as I said, we're talking about social mobility. We haven't done this on a webinar for a little while, so it's good to be revisiting this subject. Really important to our sector. I've said this many a time, but if I go back to when I started this job roughly 10 years ago, about 20% of ISE members were actually doing something in the social mobility space. That's now well over sort of 60–70% of members who are active in this space. If you follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn, you'll see yesterday that I posted an LSE blog that I thought was quite interesting. We will be getting into practice today, what we actually do, what makes a difference, but also actually what doesn't make a difference in terms of actually the engagement that we do with students and within our organisations. But also, I do think we need to think about some of the broader issues underpinning social mobility. It's not just about recruitment and development processes. You know, it's a bigger part of society and the way that society works. So we should be getting into all that and more, hopefully, in the next hour or so. So that's the ground we'll be covering, and we'll do some quick introductions, and then we'll get straight into content. So if we go around it in the order I can see on my screen. Patrick, do you want to say hello first?
Thanks, Stephen. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Patrick. I'm the founder of Vision Path. We're an early talent specialist, and we work with employers to build early careers programs that help them to move the needle on social mobility and social diversity in their workforce.
Thanks, Patrick. Dan, would you like to go next?
Hiya, Dan Doherty. I work for a company called Cognizant. We're a technology consultancy. My focus is on junior lateral recruitment, which sits between early careers and experienced hires.
Thank you, Dan. Louise, would you like to go next?
Hello, I'm Louise Ashley. I'm an academic at Queen Mary University of London, and I research social mobility, looking particularly at the relationship between social class and access to the labour market.
Fantastic. Louise, if I remember, you spoke at one of our conference panels. Was that the Brexit conference?
It was the night before. It was the day that Brexit happened. Yes, it was an interesting atmosphere that day. It was
that shell-shock morning, wasn't it? It just crossed my mind it'd be the anniversary of Brexit. Well, welcome, Louise. Thanks for taking part. And last but no means least, Ellie, would you like to say hello?
Yeah, hi everyone, thanks for having me. I work at Rolls-Royce. I look after all of our global inclusive hiring and campaigns, which essentially means, I say it's the fun part of talent acquisition, but it's the activation of all of our external employer brand. But the biggest chunk and kind of main part of my world is all about early careers, attraction and recruitment, right through from kind of schools engagement through to day one when they join us for all of our graduates and apprentices.
Great, thanks, Ellie, and thanks, panelists up front for taking the time to share your thoughts and experience and expertise with us this lunchtime. So if I start with you, Ellie, first, do you want to just give us an outline in terms of actually the steps you've taken at Rolls-Royce in terms of tackling social mobility?
Yeah, so I guess it will probably come to no surprise to people. We're a large global engineering organisation. We've got aspirations to kind of be the leading industrial technology company of the future. And so trying to attract diversity into our sector is very much the top of our priorities, particularly within the early career space, which I think is one of the biggest levers that you can use. So it's certainly a focus, but it will probably, again, come as no surprise that it is a struggle to try and get young people to engage with our organisation, particularly those that are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, from more diverse backgrounds, because they don't see us as an organisation they could want to work for. The brand is still very much associated with being a car manufacturer. It's seen as a luxury, prestigious brand, and so we have to do a lot of work to kind of try and dispel some of those myths with young people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So I think a lot of the work we've done over the past couple of years, and certainly since I've joined, is really focused on end-to-end early careers attraction and recruitment. So I think quite a lot of the time employers put a lot of great stuff out there in terms of campaign activity and how they talk with schools or how they work with people, but it feels like kind of one-time solutions or one-time focus pieces. And what we've really tried to do is move to kind of an always-on conversation with the external market and with students around coming to work for Rolls-Royce. So it's that continual drip feed of speaking to them, but actually not stop at the point of application either, and look at everything from once they've actually applied, what does that process then look like for them? So there's 3 kind of key pillars to the activity that we do. The first being around engagement, and how do we kind of reach and engage students from harder to access communities, from backgrounds where they may be the first person in their family to consider university, where they may be the first person in their families to actually even look at kind of full-time employment, particularly in kind of some of the lower socioeconomic backgrounds for females. Maybe they've kind of got no role models around them. So how do we reach them? How do we work with partnership organisations, with schools, with universities, to really engage them into what a career at Rolls-Royce could look like and what their opportunities are? The second part is then very much around access. So once we've done that engagement, we've done that kind of that inspiring piece, how do we give them access to our people, and how do we do that in a really authentic way? So it's kind of a real bugbear of mine when you see early careers or even mid-career campaigns, actually, when they are written in very corporate language, and this generation can read between the lines. They know that we're all going to go out there and kind of say that we're brilliant and we're going to be global and we want to do X, Y, and Z. So how do we get the people that are in our business that will resonate with them, the people that they see as role models, talking to them in a really authentic, transparent way? So a lot of what we then do in that space is around things like podcast series, social media content, using our brilliant apprentices and graduates, and getting them to tell their stories, and not just their stories about work, their stories about what happens outside of work, everything that makes them, because that allows these young people to be able to identify with someone and think, actually, do you know what, that's someone who's a bit like me, that's been able to get there and that does it, and this is what they do. And so all of a sudden they've got a role model and someone they can identify with. And then the real kind of linchpin, the key changing part for me is my third pillar, which is all about recruitment and selection. And it's once that individual applies and once you've done all of that fantastic work up front, which, let's be honest, where all the money is, that we throw lots of cash out and we spend hours trying to design these amazing external early careers campaigns. Once those individuals apply, how do we make sure they're successful? Because far too often we design recruitment and selection processes that are almost designed to test students. How do we remove every single barrier that might face a young person from a lower socioeconomic background and go, here you go, here's a platform, tell us what you're about, show us how you can be successful, what are your skills, what are your values, what can you bring to us, why do you want to be here, what gets you out of bed in the morning? Give them that space to be able to do that in a really safe and friendly environment. And then all of a sudden, the end result numbers and the diversity that you see is starting to translate changes. So I'm really proud to say that we're kind of like the first global engineering organisation to remove degree requirements, for example, within our graduate programs. It's been done in a lot of other sectors before, but for Rolls-Royce to do that, when we traditionally would have kind of gone after certain A levels or masters for some of our programs, to actually go, do you know what, it's not about academic qualifications, or do you know what, we don't do technical assessments anymore, because we can teach technical skills, we can teach technical knowledge, but we can't teach people to kind of have that get up and go about them, or to have a passion or an interest in our sector. So redesigning and kind of flipping the whole of our recruitment process on its head is then what's really seen the translation, and kind of actually we get some really great students apply, but now we actually get them to join us and we see them on day one. So bit of a whistle stop tour. But yeah, some of the, I guess the key kind of 3 pockets of work that we focused on in terms of trying to attract more social mobility into Rolls-Royce. That's
great, thanks, Ellie. Because I remember you spoke at our apprentices conference.
Yes.
And you were talking about, as you said, did you say you don't do numerical testing anymore? Which I thought was quite surprising for an engineering firm. I can't imagine engineers doing that willingly.
Yeah, I think they must have thought, who the hell is this woman, the day that I suggested that and said, let's remove it. But what I say is, it's not about us not testing the skills or the behaviours that we need ultimately. It was about saying, why do we do it? Right, so we do numerical testing because we want to look at people's problem solving skills. We want to look at their ability to be able to handle large amounts of data quickly and translate it and understand that, because that's what you've got to do for the job. So what's the relevant bit we were testing at that point for the end job? And then it was like, well, how can we test that in a way that works for multiple people? Or how can we test that in a way that feels more comfortable or feels more realistic? So do you know what? Let's put a case study in there where there's some data, where there's some problem solving. Let's allow the student to have a debate with an assessor who can help them understand things if they don't understand it, so they can still ask questions in that safe space. Because it's brilliant actually when we get a graduate or an apprentice that goes, I think it's like this, but I don't quite understand. And I know that's a gap for me. So I want to learn more about it. So let's have a conversation. Let's have a debate, because that shows some brilliant skills in someone anyway, far more than getting someone to be able to do fast mental maths on a psychometric test. So, yeah, it's the results now are speaking for themselves in terms of the hires that we're taking. But for me, it's been about, where are the barriers and where are the things that you're doing that actually have got no bearing on the end result, and how can you allow every student to have that platform to kind of show who they are and to be successful. So yeah, no numerical testing.
And you mentioned that word barriers, which brings on to my next question actually. What do you see as the barriers to doing more, either in your organisation or as an industry, or for all of us in early talents actually?
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge now is data around this. I think it's really easy for us to measure females, for example. You can really easily collect that data. We've collected that data for years. We have that data internally in terms of who we hire at every level of the organisation. We're targeted on it. We have to do a gender pay gap reporting. It's got the attention of very senior individuals. So something like that is really easy for us to change the dial, for us to measure, for us to talk about, and for us to really articulate what we've done. Social mobility is hard to measure. I know there's guidance out there, and we're starting to look at how we measure it really effectively now within early careers, but we don't hold that data on our current employees without having to do some really big activities and pieces to get that information, to understand it, to articulate it. And then I think the other thing within that is, people don't really necessarily want to put their name next to being socially mobile or being from a disadvantaged background. It's a bit different to kind of gender or ethnicity. They don't necessarily want to opt into saying they had free school meals, for example, or they don't quite understand. They want to escape that label. So just trying to then get that information as part of a process or through kind of talking to young people becomes more difficult. And you then get a lot of people that either want to be known as being working class, they don't want to lose the kind of where they've come from, so that they opt in, and actually really, according to the data and the margins, they shouldn't be in. I always joke about the example of David Beckham. If we just measured whether you were the first people in your family to go to university, his children would be classed as socially mobile. They'd be classed as from a disadvantaged background, when clearly very not. So it's, how do we really use the data effectively? How do we get it, first of all? How do we interpret it and really understand it? And how do then we keep moving and understand where you set benchmarks and what looks normal and what doesn't? And it's just so much harder than some of the other diversity characteristics, like trying to measure gender. So I think that's the biggest. If someone can crack that, and come up with a really nice, neat way of doing it, I think they'll be onto a winner.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? I mean, we have lots of conversations around actually getting data from people joining. That's hard enough, but actually at least you've got touch points, whereas actually everybody assumes that everybody has all the data in the world on everybody in an organization, but that's not the case at all. Is it, Ellie? Thanks. I've seen a question come in from Graham. That's a great reminder to me to tell everybody that if you've got questions for the panel, please do drop them into the Q&A box. I've got it open on my other screen, so we'll come back to those. But what we'll do is we'll go around the panel first, and then I'll come back to those a little bit later. So do please keep popping those questions in. Patrick, you're next on my list. So you do an awful lot of work at that point where employers and education interact. What do you see as the main barriers that are stopping us getting improvements in social mobility?
There's lots of what Ellie's just said around kind of measurement and so on, which are really, really important points, and that's something I'll try and come back to. But I think in terms of education and employment and that connection, what I find is just kind of the continued sort of age-old frustration on both sides, really, between employers sometimes becoming frustrated about the way schools think and work, and you know, the way they operate. And likewise, schools sometimes becoming frustrated at the expectations of employers placed upon them. And I think it creates a bit of a disconnect there. And what we see quite often is that you know, schools, I think, in the way that they approach their employers in the way they approach their schools outreach, you need, when you look at social mobility, you need to be much more kind of you need to really interrogate data around, you know, the school's profile, the profile of their students. We also need to look at that in the context of the community they're in, and we hear a lot of employers who are, you know, situated in, you know, in what might seem quite affluent areas, who believe that because of that, there isn't much of an impact they can make around social mobility, because there's a perception that actually, if you want to try and hire from your local communities, actually the communities they're in, social mobility isn't a challenge, and therefore there's not much they can do about it. So I think one of the big fundamental changes that can happen from an employer's point of view, trying to move the needle on social mobility, is actually to really understand the profile of their communities, looking at the kind of disadvantage levels, and then be able to benchmark schools against what's happening on a local level. Because actually what you then start to see is, and we find this a lot with employers that we work with on their outreach programs, is that, you know, you start to see these pockets of disadvantage in areas. And we all know about whatever area we look at, everyone's got a story of a local town or a local city where, you know there's a part of that town or city where it's kind of different to the rest of it. It might be an affluent area, but with a pocket that is regarded as more kind of disadvantaged. And it's trying to really dig into that and find where you can make the biggest impact. So rather than kind of going to schools that, you know, don't have, you know, there's kind of disadvantage profile that are going to help you to move the dial on social mobility, and then becoming frustrated that you're not seeing the kind of results of that school outreach in terms of any movement around the kind of social mobility characteristics in your pipeline, actually being a bit more kind of interrogative of data in the schools in your community and understanding where to go. That can make a big difference in how employers can kind of bring that social mobility into their outreach.
It's interesting that I mentioned our apprentice conference when I was talking to Ellie. There are a couple of things that stick in my mind from that. One is actually, I remember Lorcan, one of the panelists, saying that all the outreach stuff they'd done at schools in, you know, in disadvantaged areas, they didn't receive any applications. All the applications came from white middle class backgrounds, which I think they're still trying to unpick. Which comes on to the point I was going to make, actually, which is I looked at our last survey data, and it was quite interesting, which is that, and I think it's only recently we've started to think about this, because lots of people have talked to me about apprentice school leaver programs being drivers for diversity. Whereas actually the data seems to say that graduate programs are actually more diverse than the new school leaver apprentice programs coming on. So why do you think this is? What's driving that difference?
I think it's still perceptions of apprenticeships as a viable career path. Ellie sort of alluded to it in terms of how young people perceive apprenticeships and the opportunity there. We're finding a lot now with schools and colleges that there is a real focus and a borderline obsession with the level of an apprenticeship. So even though we all know that level 3 apprenticeships, for example, can make a massive difference in terms of giving a young person that entry point into the world of work, a lot of schools are reluctant to push kind of level 3 apprenticeships towards students because their view is that, well, they've just done level 3 because that's A level. So why would we give them another level 3 qualification and pathway to go down? So the upshot of that becomes that increasingly schools are kind of becoming less interested in anything that is kind of sub-degree level. I would even say sort of sub-level 6, whereas it wasn't a little while ago. Level 4 and above, your higher level apprenticeships were attractive. Now it seems to be the level 6 stuff. Of course, there's a lot less of that around, and I think the result of that is that fewer young people are really exploring all the apprenticeship opportunities that are out there, and then going into, you know, often being sort of funneled into programs and opportunities that are, you know, fewer of them out there and therefore much more competitive. So I think there's a real issue around the way in which apprentices are perceived by young people, the influence that schools have in terms of what they bring to their students and what they allow to be kind of their students to be exposed to in terms of different opportunities and different pathways. And I think all that combined means that young people from disadvantaged backgrounds are maybe not getting, you know, all of the opportunities they could do. through schools and colleges, which is obviously a huge kind of for employers, that is a big gateway to connect with a lot of young people. So we find that's a real challenge. And I think also, around kind of certainly with more disadvantaged young people, and if those disadvantaged young people are from ethnic minority backgrounds, for example, there can be a real kind of perception around, amongst their community around university versus apprenticeships, and the importance of going to university and seeing that as a kind of more important pathway. So there's lots in there around the kind of the influence that schools and colleges have, but also the wider perceptions in community and in family, and especially if they would otherwise be first generation to university, there might be a big drive to kind of encourage their young people to move into university rather than go down the apprenticeship route. So it's quite a complex picture, but a lot of it comes down to the influences out there and the effect they have on young people's thinking around what an apprenticeship can do for them, and then how they access it.
Great, thanks, Patrick. I've had another couple of great questions in for you. I'm resisting the temptation to ask them. We'll save them till the end. Thanks for that, Patrick. So Dan, over to yourself now. So at Cognizant, what focus are you placing on social mobility, and what do these initiatives look like that you're sort of creating or getting involved with?
So I'll break it down into sort of global, local, and then maybe within our sort of recruitment disciplines as well. So on a global scale, a couple of years ago, we pledged $250 million into our commitment to advance economic mobility, education opportunities, D&I initiatives, of which I guess they're ultimately designed to prepare underrepresented populations with those sort of skills, knowledge, tech careers, and build at the same time a diverse pipeline, not just for Cognizant, but our supply chain and other parts of the industry. On a UK level, like many of the ISE network, with some great work that they do with various partners, we've got digital skills programs that we sponsor cohorts through the Prince's Trust amongst many other partners. For those who wouldn't usually have access to those kinds of opportunities, and give them those skills, those accreditations, and effectively remove those barriers to entry that employers might be, sort of putting up themselves, which I'll dive into a little bit later. In Cognizant, as I mentioned at the start in the introduction, my pillar looks after junior lateral, but my colleague Vanessa, which many of you will know from an early careers perspective, from a graduate apprentice recruitment side of things, there's a lot of work that's been done in the I guess the resuscitation of the graduate programs here in Cognizant, particularly around evening out that playing field through various methods. Some of them that Ellie correctly sort of alluded to earlier, that's becoming more and more common, adoptive methodologies, but around being able to sort of target through data, which I completely agree with Ellie is becoming more and more of a challenge as we go further into these models, but being able to leverage some of the data around which kind of universities to target that might give us a more evenly dispersed kind of demographic from a sociability perspective, pre-live engagement platforms, so that we can give them the kind of content and maybe remove some of those imposter syndromes that might come with that kind of lower socioeconomic demographics. Access to mentors, again, on the same point, removing of the CV in terms of applying, so that removes a barrier there. Various social mobility partnerships and analysis of the process, pre, during, and post, so that we can see the impact and outputs of those methods. And things like, in terms of levy transfers into our supply chain as well, allows us to support some of the local, regional, and public sector communities. And then I guess just finally on your question, from a junior lateral perspective, that kind of complementary hiring model that sits between early careers and experienced hires, it's really about removing those education prerequisites from all of our roles. So they are not labelled that they need a degree, they're not labelled that they need to have done X, Y, Z. There's nothing to do with UCAS points in there. It's purely more about the things they might have attained through boot camps, self-taught, cross-industry, returning, reskilling, upskilling. There's an abundance of ways that people can actually formulate a potential candidate profile now, and it's not just the linear mainstream education routes that we're kind of, dare I say, institutionalized into the ages of 16 to 18. There's more talent out there, and we're probably guilty of just looking through the main the main kind of binoculars and telescopes when we look at talent in early careers, and actually it's a much more broader and wider opportunity that we've got as a sector. So yeah, that's kind of our commitments and our focuses really at Cognizant.
Yeah, since you mentioned this on a call the other day, that institutionalization and front loading of education, and I can't help thinking about, the 100-year life, the 70 years at work, and we're gonna have to think a lot differently about it. But that's a different webinar, so I mustn't go down a rabbit hole. So Dan, all those kind of initiatives that you've been talking about, what in your experience is actually working? What are those social mobility actions that work and make a difference?
Yeah, so on the early talent front, in terms of the work that that Vanessa's team have done, the platforms that have been used to warm those candidates up pre-live, provide mentoring, help them feel prepared, particularly if they haven't got that kind of infrastructure around them, or that network, or that careers advisory provision, or maybe have a disruptive home life, or kind of post-COVID world. All those kind of factors that come into play that can affect many people. The removal of CVs has obviously helped. It's become a more attractive and even playing field. Partnerships with the likes of Bridge of Hope and that kind of umbrella of networks and charities and social enterprises, which help us to kind of put our roles out towards networks which aren't normally where you would probably find them on campus or in schools or in colleges, that kind of normal milk round and school leavers outreach attraction. It actually was one of our top performing referral platforms for last year's intake. So definitely a platform to look out for. And what it led to really from a 2022 intake perspective was that from the Bridge group who analysed the intakes, was found that it was an actual best-in-class case study in terms of where state school candidates had offered candidates that outperformed independent school candidates, and we had a very evenly distributed deciles on the indices of multiple deprivation. So in terms of what Ellie said earlier around all these different ways that we can obviously measure, we haven't got a countrywide common measurement for social mobility that everybody adopts. Each company even looks at different things, whether it's free school meals and postcode analysis, what's reported in even ISE surveys versus what UCAS use versus what other, independent bodies might use, is all very different. And that makes it completely echo what Ellie said. It's so difficult to almost work out like where you're at. And I think we can only really look at our own, where we're starting from and where we're trying to get to, and look at our kind of own progression models. On the junior lateral front, our focus has been about the demand side of talent economics, I guess I'd call it, not necessarily the supply. And so what I mean by that is that by the removal of anything education prerequisites wise and focusing more on actually screening in and screening out, it allows us to kind of identify more underrepresented groups that obviously have been overlooked because they've got too much of something or not enough of another, or they don't fit in a bucket that our sector's kind of created. So we actually organically get talent personas, which could be anything from university dropouts to returners and reskillers, upskillers, people that don't fit the normal kind of factory line of supply of talent that our kind of sector is used to competing for, really, in terms of a sort of a talent war. These are kind of hard to find, these people, which is why maybe not a lot of employers have actually tried to find them, because they're not in the school, in the college, on the campus, on the website, on the big platforms. They're in amongst everywhere else. So I think what you can control is actually the demand side of that talent economics, which is making it easier to apply, making it easier to actually get through those stages, not by downgrading the quality of the hire, but actually widening it out. And naturally, a lot of not just the socioeconomic D&I metrics, but a lot of your other D&I metrics might actually improve in parallel. And so, building out those partnerships that are focused on those talent personas so that they can help bring those people to you, and you haven't got to kind of spread yourself too thin. Rewriting those job descriptions, really downgrading them. I think it was mentioned earlier about how you write them in the language that they will understand. Well, there's actually multiple generations and multiple people that you might need to kind of communicate to. So it's being a little bit more allowing that language to be quite palatable across a broader scale as well. And really educating the business that you're in. You know, we have the luxury of quite receptive business leaders who will trust, you know, those SMEs across the business to do things different. And I think, yeah, you will find that you don't need massive budgets. You can do things a little bit different with what we've got control over, which is the demand side, as opposed to kind of always trying to work out how to influence the supply side. And I just kind of finally add on that was it feels like the education criteria has been kind of inflamed a little bit, is my personal view, where we've got criteria that's maybe driven by government or by looking over the shoulder of our competitors and looking at what they're doing, and that's actually inflaming the entry point. So if we actually take another look at those inflammatory education prerequisites, even in those graduate and apprentice and placement and intern programs, you could find that you're going to attract a much more diverse pool as an organic result.
Great, thanks, Dan. Again, you're encouraging lots of questions coming through, which we'll come back to later. Just a final question before we move on to Louise. What do you think either yourselves at Cognizant or employers, our sector in general, could be doing differently?
Yeah, so I've probably come from a background in other employers where we had no choice but to have multiple intakes of recruitment in graduate and apprentice worlds, which meant that we tended to find that organically we had a more diverse intake in terms of things like age and social mobility from intakes that were in the cyclical cycle. So that kind of cyclicality that we have of like almost a Ferris wheel of Q3, Q4 applications of the prior year to start the following year in the kind of the summer, Q2, Q3. And it's kind of quite predictable as to what you need to go and get and what you will get. And when we were finding that we were hiring out of season, i.e. start dates that were kind of in the middle of the academic year, naturally you will get a broader age range. You will get people who've dropped out of uni. You'll get people who haven't got through clearing. You'll people get that didn't necessarily secure things like placement and internships and maybe finished, you know, their courses slightly earlier. We found reskillers, upskillers, people coming out of the army and places, you know, that were veterans. We had industry movers. We didn't actually realize, we didn't do anything to target them. They effectively found us, which again means, you know, it becomes a lot easier. So I think the cyclicality point is, you know, think about whether your business can accommodate multiple intakes for a naturally organic, more diverse talent pool, including the socio-economic side. And I think in terms of questioning kind of what we do sector-wide, it feels like we are maybe ignoring kind of some of that untapped potential. We're kind of building out career routes which match the expectations of almost that institutionalized factory line of talent, which is coming out of that kind of 16 to 18-year-old kind of age group. And they don't know anything other than what they've been told and what they've been ushered and sort of sheep penned towards. And I just kind of see that maybe we're missing a trick on focusing too much on that supply side. And actually our models are quite static on the employer side. And I think we can probably start to see maybe a little bit more collaboration internally and perhaps even more blurred lines between these programs that come up with sharp returners, veterans, early careers, experienced hire, junior, reskilling. I think we're going to find that becomes a lot more broader as we go through. So it's something to think about and leverage really internally if you've got the infrastructure to do that.
That's really interesting, Dan. It strikes me that I was just thinking I remember when the age legislation changed. I've got grey hairs, and everybody used, because an audience won't remember this, but actually employers used to say only recent graduates can apply. You must have graduated, all that kind of stuff, and that all disappeared. And for a moment there was a lot of conversation about mature students, and that all disappeared quite quickly actually. And I think it's a subject that maybe we should definitely go back to. So thanks for that, Dan. Again, I've got questions. I'll come back to you on those a little bit later. So Louise, finally to yourself. You've been sat there very patiently listening to all these experiences from the panel, from either their organisations or from Patrick's work, both with employers and in the school sector. So what are your reflections overall on how our employers are tackling social mobility?
Thanks, Stephen. This is such a fascinating discussion, and one thing I'd say, I've been looking at this for years now, I think, and it's just so evident that the level and sophistication of the discussion has improved so dramatically since then. And, you know, listening to everybody here, we kind of 10 years ago, we were predominantly talking about supply side issues. So it was all about kind of changing the characteristics of people coming in. And that was very much a sort of deficit model of diversity. It wasn't very effective. And now, as we're seeing today, there's much more emphasis on looking at both supply and demand, and much more kind of innovative solutions that are being applied to this problem. It's really interesting listening to Dan. I hope I'm going to not misread what you said, Dan, but one of the things that we see a lot in this field, particularly around recruitment and selection, is that quite dysfunctional practices in relation to talent become institutionalized and locked in over time. And that can, funnily enough, happen even when people know they're quite dysfunctional. And that one kind of thing that drives that is that we sort of collect around so-called best practice. And we do that partly because there are benefits to organizations in imitating each other. So organizations in the same field tend to imitate each other. And they do that in the face of uncertainty, even when those practices are not that efficient or that effective. And sorry to use this, but we call that institutional isomorphism. As I said, it's quite dysfunctional. So I guess the point I'm trying to make there is that it's really important to look at what good practice looks like, but it's also really important to know what's right for your organization and to be courageous enough to do things differently if that feels right for you. So that institutionalization can be a real problem in driving more innovative practices, particularly in this area. Just to go up a level very briefly, and I won't spend too long on this, if we kind of address this from a more, I suppose, higher level, an abstract level, if you like, one of the things that I do is I look at why practices and policies in this area don't work sometimes as well as we might hope that they would. And that's not meant to be negative, it's to try and understand the root causes of inequality so that we can do things better. And also to sort of try and help understand why this is quite difficult. So why, even when people are doing an incredible job in very difficult circumstances, change can be relatively slow. And to do that, it's really important to contextualize social mobility within our wider society and economy. One of the things when we look at this is sometimes we call this a wicked problem. I'm sure that people here will be familiar with that, but change management specialists often divide problems into different types. So critical problems are the result of crisis, they need urgent action. Tame problems are more operational, they're generally solvable. Wicked problems are extremely complex. They originate in many parts of society. There may not be a single solution or a solution at all. And one challenge is that not everybody agrees what the problem is, or even that the problem exists. And I think we can call social mobility at the widest level one of those problems. And that matters because when we think of solving these problems, we can think of society as a sort of open system with lots of different moving parts. And ideally, we need those parts to be working more or less in the same direction to make things like social mobility happen. And I think it's probably fair to say that's not quite where we are at the moment in the UK generally. So just to give one very simple example, social mobility generally is much more likely in countries which are less unequal on the grounds of things like income and education and wealth. And the UK is highly unequal on all those grounds. So any activities that organisations are taking, many of which are absolutely brilliant, can kind of be contextualised against that wider background, which can make these things more difficult to affect. If we narrow down a little bit, we could think of higher education. So one motivation behind the expansion of higher education was to enhance and improve social mobility. It didn't have that effect. It hasn't really had that effect at all. And that's because there's lots of other processes happening within organisations and elsewhere that are sort of working in the opposite direction. So that's sort of a bit of contextualisation. In an ideal world, we need those systems to be more closely aligned. That's not something that organisations can necessarily do. It tends to be requiring levers that are pulled at the level of the state. So that does make this partly a political question. That could be quite difficult to discuss, but I think generally when we're talking about social mobility, we probably shouldn't lose sight of that.
I think that's a really, really good point, Louise. That's why I mentioned that LSE blog that I just happened to read yesterday over lunch, because it did start to unpick actually what are we talking about social mobility. It's interesting when it says there isn't agreement. I've got a friend who is not stupid, who will argue point blank that you can be whatever you want to be in the UK. We're one of the most, truly meritocratic society, which is yes, not a view I think a lot of others share, but those differences of opinion are out there. And it's in some of our conversations, I think I've said this to you before, Louise, it's interesting. reflecting on some of the things we've talked about. So I think our industry has often come from this from a psychology-led approach, which is psychologists, who we use to help us build selection tools and selection processes, whereas actually you're a social scientist, aren't you? So that whole thing around structures and agency. Apart from employers just being more aware of actually the subject and those pressures, are there things you think that in employers, or maybe those of us who work in early talent, can do to to get beyond just that kind of that purely operational view of what we're doing?
Yeah, I think that is already happening, and I think that this conversation today is really making it evident that kind of progressive employers are looking beyond that individualized and psychologized approach and really thinking about structures and systems insofar as they're structures and systems that they can control, and working out what levers to pull to make that more possible. So a really simple example would be that an individualized or psychologized approach to diversity and inclusion would focus on things like unconscious bias. So that would suggest that the primary reason that we're not appointing people from more diverse backgrounds is because we have unconscious bias towards them, which is probably true. It's not saying that we don't, but that is only a small part of the issue. And therefore, if that's where we focus our efforts, it's probably going to have a very, very limited effect. And actually, there is no evidence really suggesting that unconscious bias training, for example, does have any particularly significant effect on opening access. So, I think more and more employers have recognised that and are moving to thinking about changing structures and systems which reduce bias within those systems and have a less individualistic impact. They can help more people, if you like. So I do think that is happening actually over time, and we're seeing a gradual shift in that direction. So I do think that's positive. But I think that, as a sociologist, I would say but these are quite politicized questions, and I think it is always worth remembering or being cautious about how debates around D&I and social mobility are often depoliticized, because when that happens, it tends to suit people who already have most power. So we need to remember that politics with a small p, I'm talking about, is really part of this, and how we approach it and how we think about these questions more generally, including how we define social mobility and what we think the problem is.
And is there also, this is a slightly leading question, but is there a danger that we, because I know you said this on some of the things I've talked to you about, there's a danger that we make it an individual issue or problem, i.e. if you give the individual the tools, they can fix everything themselves, whereas actually that's not always the case.
Yeah, for critics of social mobility as a policy agenda, this is one of the underlying problems. So social mobility, I'll try to explain this as quick as I can, but social mobility is often considered to be an agenda about addressing inequalities. And in one sense it is. It's about addressing kind of unfair outcomes in the workplace. But critics, I suppose I might be one of them, would suggest that actually what social mobility is about is really legitimating inequalities as much as solving them. Because that basically it works on the assumption that if you can tell people that they live in a meritocratic society and that jobs are allocated purely on the basis of talent and hard work, then you can legitimate very steep inequalities of income and wealth, because you can argue also that those inequalities are fair. So people at the top of the tree both deserve those rewards, and kind of those are fairly allocated as well. So for a lot of people, social mobility is seen as a way to legitimate inequalities as opposed to address them. And that's significant because in the UK, we've had a very strong focus on social mobility, less so on inequality, just as inequalities of income and wealth have been getting much wider. And it is a very individualistic agenda. So it helps certain individuals who have exceptional talent and doesn't do an awful lot for the people who are so-called left behind. So we do have to be a little bit careful about that. Thinking about the definition of social mobility, so we can also define it in terms of kind of collective economic mobility, and that would draw our attention to issues around low wage, for example, and working conditions, as well as who's getting the kind of the so-called top jobs as well. So there's different ways of looking at it, and I do think that's really important, not to individualize too far.
Great, thanks, Louise. I could ask you a whole bunch more questions, but I'm conscious of the clock on my laptop, which says we've got just under a quarter of an hour left, and we've had quite a few questions through. So thanks for that, Louise, and thanks to all the panel again for those insights. So let's go to your questions from the audience. We've got quite a few through already. If you've got any more, do pop them into the Q&A. I'll try to get through them all in the time that we've got. So let's see where we get to. So Ellie, back to yourself. So the first question came through for yourself, and the question was, have you worked with graduate development team to ensure that both they and the line managers are working positively with the broader demographics? So I guess this is the getting beyond the recruitment bit. It's what actually happens when people join, questions of retention, etc.
Yeah, no, fantastic question. And if someone can ever crack stakeholder management within a large global organization, I think they'd be a millionaire. But yeah, so a lot of our, well, in fact, yeah, all of our kind of corporate early careers programs have governance boards within the business. So we don't kind of operate a centralized learning model. There are business leads and individuals out in the business that support the design and the creation of those programs, which I think, whilst there are areas of early careers it hinders, and it's not a perfect model, it really helps in these sorts of situations, because you have some fantastic senior leader champions who are already part of that conversation. So for me, a lot of the changes that we make were about getting the right individuals within the business, and the people that that can kind of act as those change agents for you, with their peers and their stakeholders then, and taking them on that journey. So if I take the assessment redesign piece as an example, whilst it was led from a TA perspective, whilst we have experts that kind of do the activity for us, we used both early career individuals, apprentices and graduates who were there, and then also leaders who are part of the program designs and are part of shaping why we do early talent within the business areas, were part of that design process, and were able to feed and were able to share their thoughts. And they were part of the dialogue again with neurodiverse apprentices, with graduates from socio-economic backgrounds, to be part of that conversation so they could learn and they could share. And it's about taking people on that journey with you and including them. So we've not cracked it in terms of starting. I'm not going to sit here and say it's perfect that all of these individuals join and we don't kind of have our problems or have areas where we're learning as we go. But it's about having that continuous conversation and having some really strong business champions and business leaders that can kind of get behind it, and building those relationships. But yeah, there were probably days where people thought I was absolutely bonkers. It's about just persevering and going with it.
Definitely. It's interesting, that problem of line managers. It's something that keeps recurring, actually. I was reading an article yesterday. It wasn't to do in the social mobility space, but the broader D&I space, an industrial tribunal that ruled against an employer, and it was the line manager's behaviour. And it just made me think that, yes, you can have all the policies, all the training, but if the line managers, if it falls down there, if they don't implement this was a racial harassment case, then it's still got to get to that point. I've got a next question, which actually I think also ties into a similar one that was asked for you, Dan, so I'll come back to you as well once I've just asked it to Ellie. So the question, I'm paraphrasing slightly, is around actually that resource for a recruitment process. So one of the reasons, let's be blunt, that that employers have put in place academic credentials or certain other mechanisms, it's to reduce the volume of applications to a manageable number, just because cost, time pressures, etc. So by removing some of those barriers, does that give you resource problems? Are there other challenges that you have to face in terms of accessing that broader pool of talents? Maybe it's more applications, maybe it's having to think differently about selection. I don't know. So it's about, that was what the question was broadly about, is do you have to sort of change processes to take account of that?
Yeah, so I think there's two bits for me in this. I think there's something around people said, well, you're not just going to get more applications. And I said, for me, it's about getting the right type of applications. So you can't go everywhere. So what we do in a lot of our attraction now is we've shifted where we are. So you might not see us actually at all of the big graduate careers fairs, for example, but you will see us sponsoring STEM women events. You will see us at social mobility activities. You'll see us in more local community things. And so the application numbers haven't necessarily changed that drastically, but we've shifted the type of applications. And then what I would say in terms of the process, yes, there is a level of kind of more human interaction that we put in. I think there's benefit in that you see a higher success rate from these diverse candidates because they're actually getting human interaction. They're getting phone calls, they're not just getting automated bits of the process. But we certainly haven't stripped stuff out. So we still do online testing. But the online testing that we do is a situational based online test. You can bypass it if you're neurodiverse, because we know that neurodiverse individuals, autistic individuals, for example, struggle with those sorts of testing. So that's absolutely fine. That removes that kind of that challenge or where that discrimination may come in for those groups. But the situational judgment testing has been written and designed by our current graduates and apprentices. They wrote actual situations and examples that they face in their day-to-day. scenarios. They wrote the answers. Yeah, they've been jazzed up into kind of like nice corporate language and popped into an online digital tool, but it's not an off-the-shelf solution. And so we still use that to filter. We still use that to bring down application numbers. But what we're doing is what I feel is we're testing them on something that is a real life example that has been written by our graduates and apprentices that live and breathe what they do on their programs. We're not putting them through an off-the-shelf numerical test where you have to do mental maths extremely quickly, which you don't actually need to do in your job. So it's about looking at what you bring out and what you put in its places. So we've still certainly got some of that activity within our processes. We still have to sift, but we don't sift on CVs. So that saves a massive amount of time. We sift on the same 3 upfront application questions that all candidates get asked, which focuses on them and what they can bring. And so it makes it a lot easier because you're not trying to pull information out of CVs. So it's about looking at it cleverly and smartly, I would say, rather than just going, do you know what, we're going to strip out all of the reasons why we do this to bring the numbers down. They're still certainly in there, we're just doing it differently.
Great, thanks, Sally. That was really informative. Similar question to you, Dan, around that actually broadening out who you're hiring, the eligibility criteria. Does that give you any resource or process challenges that you've had to think about?
I mean, not to speak overly on behalf of Vanessa's early talent, operations, but I know from the removal of the CV, that in theory would give you a more attractive kind of application volume, and you would expect. I think the work that's gone into the platforms to engage with them and the targeting, some of the less represented groups helps to obviously balance out the demographic that represents that early application window. There is some sprints and cycles in the more traditional sort of early careers campaigns for those sort of graduate intakes, but because of the removal of the CV and the alternative assessments and testing in a digital format, it allows people to kind of, I guess, in a reasonably automated fashion, get through those kind of relevant steps. So resource wise, it's more the middle end where they're going to need more people. So it's kind of utilizing technology where it can help, but not removing the human element to that. When it comes to the junior lateral side, our demand is less kind of predictable. It's not pathway specific, it's more specific, sort of technical or niche roles, but downgraded to a lower part of the talent pyramid. And we're generally open for a lot of a shorter period. So we have to kind of make sure that our roles are put in front of people that wouldn't normally see it, but there will be different types of those roles coming up throughout the year. So for us, our actual volumes are quite sizable because there is less restrictive barriers to entry. So people are not put off by applying as much. And we do get graduates applied to our junior lateral roles. They are part of a demographic, but we also get university dropouts, apprentice completers, second jobbers, industry movers, returners, all those sort of kind of subcategorized demographics, if you call it, compared to the mainstream school leaver, on campus. So the challenges we have are, I guess, they're not challenges, but we probably operate in a more experienced, higher world, but hiring at a junior level. That's the best way to describe it. And it's up to us really how inefficient we make that. There's no point staying open longer if we don't need to, and jeopardize your brand that you've built up by having to let loads of people down. If there's no need to have hundreds and thousands of people apply for a couple of roles, then don't. In a former role, our applications per year for early careers went down year on year because we'd really tightened up the pre-live. And actually that made us more operationally efficient because we needed around 3 to 4, maybe even 5,000 less applicants a year for 300-400 roles. So there is ways of doing that in the pre-live world, which I think is often overlooked. And the irony of that is that you need some resource to really manage the pre-live. So if you shift it, as Ellie said earlier, around, where the cash and where the attraction, in some respects, where the attention and focus largely should be on the recruitment, is at the front end, because that really does set a good sort of a good momentum for the rest of the process if you can tweak the bit at the front.
Got it. Very quickly, Dan, so there's a question about mature students. I've got a view on this, but I wonder what your take would be. Mature students who maybe apply to those roles you were talking about, who may, in a sense, want their prior experience taken into account, maybe a bit resistance to sort of almost starting again. Do you have any advice for those students? Is there a mindset thing? Do you find those students get the question asked, those actually in the long run, they might start at a more junior stage, but actually their experience maturity then enables them that they progress quicker?
This is one of the talent personas. I won't share the chap's name, but he was a grad. He did his engineering degree. He went and worked for a large engineering company, and came across us because they were one of our clients, and he spent 6 years in that domain, and he wanted to reskill. And he thought the best way to do that was do a master's in something IT related to get into the tech sector. That is literally what these people will do, is further go into debt to try and move careers, when really that's the employer's job to make sure that those movements are much more accessible and easier, rather than going back into education to go back into employment. So this particular guy, 6 years, went and did a master's in computer science with business, and couldn't get onto graduate jobs because he wasn't finishing university in his undergrad within that 1, 2, 3 years, which is another barrier for a lot of grads or ex-grads. So he actually found a role at a higher level, a higher salary, a higher level of responsibility, because he became the most important part of the team on that client site, because he was the most knowledgeable in that particular domain. He had more years of that industry experience than anybody on that project. So individualizing the recruitment process for those roles, that was a great example of going, computer would have said no in the standard early careers world. Experienced hire would have said no, because you're not a seasoned business analyst. But in the junior lateral world, you're yes all day long. And actually the irony was that the practice leader was recruiting what he thought him for a graduate role, and actually moved him into the junior lateral process. So, I think it's adding the right bits to the process where we can add some human, intelligence, I guess, or common sense to the situation. Definitely does help.
Definitely. We're going to come back to this subject, Jan, because I think this is the future of this, what this early talent is, a much broader definition, but I'm conscious of time and going down another rabbit hole, which I have a tendency to do. Patrick, can I bring, I've got a couple of questions left, one for you, Patrick, and then one for you, Louise. And I think this question relates, actually, I saw the comment you made on my LinkedIn post. I've not had time to reply to yet, but I did read it, and it's around local labour markets, impact of COVID landscape, hybrid remote working, and I guess it's around that importance of place and how do you see that local labour market being impacted? And I'm thinking about, we discovered over the last year that your office is pretty close to where I live, and there's without going into too much detail, I used to live in Epping, Essex. Epping's got quite a lot of people thinking about London and going into London. Harlow, where I live now, 10 minutes drive up the road, talking to local schools, people just don't see London as an option. So I don't know, any comments on that whole issue around place, and is that changing, and is hybrid going to change it, and do we need to think about local labour markets as well?
I think, yeah, it's a really interesting one about locations. One of the biggest things we think about when we're looking at our early careers programs is actually, how can young talent get to work? I think there is, when we look at the kind of school outreach and when we're profiling schools we want to go into as part of those outreach programs, we look at, an example would be, okay, 45 minutes from employer's location, public transport only, no more than one change. Why do we do that? Well, it's because when particularly thinking about young people from more disadvantaged backgrounds, you can't assume they're going to have a car, and public transport might be a better way of and more accessible for them. That sometimes means that we will go into schools that are further away from the employer's location than others, because actually the public transport links in that respect are better. I accept that's not necessarily going to work in every location, but in some locations that is a way of doing it. So I think understanding some of the challenges around access to employment and looking at transport and so on is a big part of it, and that might take to places you might not think about. I think on the point about COVID and hybrid working, the question I think is probably saying, well, actually, has that presented an opportunity to go beyond the immediate local areas because hybrid is an option? It can. I would say that talking to young people and about their coming into the world of work, actually most of them want to be in an office environment, and actually I remember during the right in the midst of COVID, writing an article on LinkedIn about is COVID actually going to help social mobility a bit, because it will broaden access to opportunities for young people, because hybrid working and so on might mean that things are easier to get to. I haven't seen that in actuality in the last couple of years, and I think actually a lot of young people, the question they're asking is not how often can I work from home, but is it okay for me to be in the office most of the time? And young people need that kind of support. So if that's the question that's being asked, I think it is. I think actually hybrid working, remote working, certainly for young people from more disadvantaged backgrounds, is not attractive. And I think as a result, I don't think it's having a huge impact in terms of, place, location, where you're going to. I think there's still a focus on trying to keep it more local, making it accessible, but just being mindful of some of the unique challenges that young people from more disadvantaged backgrounds might face in terms of actually physically getting to work, and how do you make sure that it's really accessible for them. So those are big things that we think about.
Great, thanks, Patrick. Right, I'm conscious we're slightly over time, but I'm going to sneak in one more question for you, Louise. It's a great question from Graham, actually. So Graham says, is social mobility too much of a euphemism? Should we talk about something like class discrimination instead? Would that help delegitimize the inequality excuse?
Oh, I'll be as quick as I can, Stephen. I think it doesn't have to be either or. I think it should be both and. So I think we should talk about social mobility and inequality, because they're two sides of the same coin. We should talk about class discrimination, but recognise, and I think we've really seen this today, that class discrimination at the point of the labour market isn't always individual. It's often institutionalised in systems and structures. And what we're hearing today is amazing work to deinstitutionalise that, to change those systems and structures to reduce the effect. So I think that's fantastic.
Fantastic, great. Patrick, Dan, Louise, Ellie, thank you very much. Really rich debate, and we could have kept going for much longer, I'm sure, but conscious of people's time and headspace. So thank you very much. This is a subject that we will be returning to. Look out for the recording. We will have that coming up online. So join in the conversation. There's quite a bit of stuff out there on our social channel. So it'd be really great to continue this debate. And if you want to ping me a message, got any more questions for the panelists, do come through me. More than happy to pass those messages on. So thank you very much. Really great session from you. I really appreciate you putting the time into this, and thanks to everybody from tuning in. Enjoy the rest of the day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.